Thank you, Charles. Welcome, everybody. This is Anthony Keoli. I'm the Regional Director for the Alaska Region TTA Center. We're excited to be hosting today's National ANA webinar on climate change and strengthening resiliency on native lands. The Alaska Region, which is hosting today's webinar, is comprised of our three core staff: myself, the Regional Director; Angela Camus, our Training and Technical Assistance Manager; and Charles Peel, our Technology and E-Outreach Manager. Charles is moderating today.
The Alaska TTA Center is one of the four national training and technical assistance centers. We're all resources of the Administration for Native Americans, and we provide technical assistance to our grantees, free technical assistance. We do workshops, training, technical reviews of applications, and we support ANA's programs. Those programs include the National SEATT, Social and Economic Development program, the recently implemented Alaska SEDS, the Environmental Regulatory Enhancement Program. Those three programs are related to the topic that we're presenting on today, and are potential resources for Native communities that are looking at strengthening resiliency. So ANA promotes self-sufficiency for Native Americans by providing discretionary grant funding for community-based projects and training and technical assistance to eligible tribes and Native organizations. And ANA's vision is that Native communities are thriving. Some of our upcoming webinars include data collection on May 14th, hosted by the Eastern Region, learning from and building on short-term and long-term outcomes throughout the life of a project and beyond, May 28th, hosted by the Pacific Region, and community planning, community readiness assessment, on June 11th, hosted by the Western Region. So the goals for today's webinar is we want to highlight some of the effects of climate change in Native communities in the ANA service areas, Alaska, Pacific, Western, and Eastern. We want to address how Native communities are adapting to and mitigating the effects of climate change. And also we're looking forward to highlighting some potential resources. So just a little background information. As a former tribal administrator in the 90s at Native Village of Quinnahock, we did quite a bit of infrastructure development, and it's been somewhat sobering to see the amount of change over the last decade, especially the impacts of that on some of the infrastructure that we developed. Just some examples include the clinic building that we developed, funded, and built has been subject to thawing, degrading permafrost, and is now basically the foundation system is migrating out and currently threatening the whole facility. We constructed the Aralic Road, which is a couple miles long, and we've seen huge settlement on that road in particular. We're also experiencing major coastal erosion just in the last couple of years, 20 to 30 feet or more, and that's impacting some of the new facilities that have been constructed, such as the new sewage lagoon. So we're definitely seeing the impacts, and it's having an impact on infrastructure, and we're having to now deal with that. So we've got quite a few presenters today. I'm happy to introduce some of them. We've got Michelle Davis here, actually in our offices here in Wasilla. Michelle's from Region 10. She's the tribal coordinator for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. We have Michael Brubaker. He's the director for the Center for Climate and Health at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. Chris Whitehead with the Sitka tribe, and Sean Hart, the climate change coordinator for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So our first presenter today is Michelle Davis with the Environmental Protection Agency, Region 10. She is the tribal coordinator, and Michelle is an enrolled member of the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska, and is from the Tlingit Eagle Moiety and the Killer Whale House. Before she joined EPA, she was the Alaska Regional Coordinator for the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. Michelle is one of the tribal coordinators with the U.S. EPA Region 10. She works with Alaskan tribes in the southeast, as well as Prince William Sound. And she is also working on tribal climate change issues in Region 10.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi everybody, how's the sound? Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Well, hello, it's really an honor to be here. And just a couple quick notes. I know it's a very crowded, full agenda, and so I think what I'll do is hold questions until the end of things. And the presentation that I'll be giving you Just two things to know. First, this is the presentation that I gave to the National Congress of American Indians for their climate change workshop. And the second is that this has the thinking of a lot of good people. I'd like to acknowledge my good friend Wilson Justin and Victoria Hike-Steer for their painstaking review that they gave this. So this is more than just me here talking to you. So let's start. So preparing for climate change is incredibly complicated. I think that Wilson started us off beautifully when he said that we're on a long road, and it's going to take all of our best efforts to keep this beautiful world for our children's children. And so that is the framework within which we're working. The federal programs are beginning to address climate change, but they need to do more. As you all know, better than anybody, the impacts are being seen now. Because there was no starting point for climate change work, the federal programs tend to loosely follow the national dialogue, minus community and regional inputs. And so they're slow to respond to the changes that you are seeing. Agencies have a bad habit of trying to manage climate change, is what Wilson said, and it's become unmanageable. So now it's all about changing how we think and live. So really we are at a point where change is happening, and we have to change our thinking. And so how do you prepare? How do you begin to do what nobody has really done before? First is that you remember who your people are. The Tlingit people had stopped and they were looking at the glacier. And excuse me if I make mistakes in the telling of this. And then 4 women stepped forward and they volunteered to take the journey under the glacier. And they went forward and they went down under the glacier and journeyed through and came out to the beach. And it was a rich land and it was a good place. And then they journeyed back home. And they said, "We are here, trust us, go forward, go under the ice." They made it. They made it down through the ice. 3 days, 3 nights later, they came through the ice caverns, and they came to the new homelands for the Tlingit people. And this story, to me, it illustrates that as tribal people, we have always lived in a changing world. We have led each other through it. We don't know exactly what the future looks like, but we're going to get there. And it's going to take bravery and courage and doing things that maybe are new. But as tribal people, we have always done this. Okay? So the point here is to remember who your people are. Look to your past, but plan for the future. It's really important that you talk to your elders because they remember where people used to hunt, fish, gather, and live. And the elders know your sources of clean water. Okay? The important thing for the tribes is to have a vision. A vision of what healthy communities, of where you would like to live. A vision is a dream of what's possible. It's a picture of what the tribe wants to be and how it wants to look in the future. So before starting climate change work, where you're responding to one issue after another, one challenge, one problem, the things that Charles and that Anthony described when we started, the changing in the infrastructure, changings in traditional gathering areas, resources. Get a vision for your community and then be daring. Think big. Think about communities that are healthy and places for children and places for elders and places to prepare traditional foods. All the tribal community needs to be invited to every part of the visioning process. Projects have strong support if the community is fully involved, elders, teenagers, to participate. So before planning for the crises, the events that are there, I really suggest that tribal communities take the time to create a vision of what they would like their community to look like. Okay, that will guide you as you go forward. Now, my good friend Victoria Hike-Steer, I don't know if you guys have had the pleasure of seeing Vicki speak, but she's very eloquent and has worked for quite a while on climate change. And she says to imagine yourselves richly. Richly. healthy communities, clean water, safe places. So take that time to develop that vision. Okay. And in Vicky's bio that she has included here, it says that she's a known troublemaker, and she's also a professor over at Alaska Pacific University. Okay, Victoria's quote, and I just think it's such a nice way to think about the work going forward. So this is a picture my artwork by Ken Lisborn, and this is a picture by Ken Lisborn, and it shows the walrus, and it's kind of, you can see their life is good. The birds are coming back, they're enjoying the sunshine, they're happy. And the reason I'm showing this is that the knowledge and information that your elders have is really important to think about. What does it look like when life is good? What does it look like when the environment is healthy? Hold on to those memories. Use them to guide you. Okay. So each community and each tribal nation is unique. Your place is going to shape your experience. A coastal community is going to have very different experiences than their neighbor 10 miles away who's upriver. Communities on high ground will have different challenges than those in low-lying areas. But there are some common themes. Okay, water, earth, air, and fire. If you lose water due to melting snowpack or prolonged drought, melting permafrost, the core issue is water insecurity. So you can look at common technologies, shared tech responses, because the issue is water access. Okay. If you're losing lands due to expanding permafrost or loss of permafrost, erosion, or expanding sand dunes, the end result is that there's less land to support the traditional way of life. Now, if animals are not there due to loss of sea ice or loss of forest habitat, the issue is food security. So there's many roads that are leading to some common themes. So look first at home. Watch the national things, but think about, what does the water look like? What will the effect be in your area? What is your situation? An elder once said, everything that happens here will eventually happen everywhere else. Okay, so this is Kivalina. This is an island in New Jersey. And, you just have to stop and think, will the ocean be kinder in one place than the other? No, the impacts are going to be seen. What we're seeing here will be seen everywhere else. So adaptation. People are going to have to think about how they respond to everything. Okay. Across the world, there's an immediate need for adaptation. These are some very general categories. I'm going to give a few quick examples of some adaptations and then close with some resources that are available to support your work. All right, so this is a map, and this is actually by the National Geographic, and it's called If All the Ice Melted. And this is far, far, far in the future, a complete worst case scenario. Okay, but with the melting Antarctic ice sheet, some of the projections now are starting at 6 meters. Many, many factors will influence what happens where you live. Glacial rebound, water temperature, and latitude, all of these things will make a difference where you are. But even small changes in sea level rise increase frequency and severity of storms and storm surges. So it's really important to look at what are the projections for where you live, for your place. Okay. This was prepared by the University of Arizona, and it shows the potential inundation from a 4-meter sea level rise in western Alaska. And I'm sorry for the poor graphic. It was kind of the best I could find. So this is 13 feet, and it's very concerning. It shows the potential of what sea level rise can do. So ask the universities, ask the local landscape conservation cooperatives to work with your community on predictions of what you will see, because the effects are going to be different from one place to the next. Begin to educate your tribal members, your council, Devote staff time and resources to learning your situation and staying informed. It may not be sea level rise where you live. It might be temperature change, it might be drought, increased precipitation like sudden torrential rainfall or ocean acidification. But you have to learn what might be coming so that you can educate your communities. So on emergency preparedness, one of the things I wanted to say is that you can do formal preparations. You can have the plans on paper. You can have everything written down. That's very important. It's very important that anybody in the office knows what to do and can grab a manual so they can start. But also start informally. One of the tribes nearby to where I live has a Connex, and it's just packed with emergency supplies. They've got water, coats, dried food, blankets. That Connex is just standing by in case they need it. So go ahead and just, think about being ready. Okay. The other thing is to look at your slow-moving emergencies. This is from New Talk. And remember that children are a gift to all of us. And moving them to a safe new home, ensuring that they have safe places, is really vital. And in some communities, their safety is threatened by erosion and flooding. In others, it can be fire, health issues. But remember, we're doing this not for ourselves, but we're doing it for others. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting adaptation, and this is from Canada. Look back at the old ways, your old traditions. Another example of adaptation are safety cabins. As an adaptation to changing travel conditions, First Nations people are building safety cabins for hunters that are stranded by the now unpredictable weather. Okay, so, but we've always had that tradition of having cabins where people could go. So look back at what people used to do. Okay. So protect and improve aquatic habitat. I think that as temperatures change, and the researchers agree with me, that protecting fish and wildlife habitat is going to be vital. There are a lot of successful restoration projects that tribes can look to. The Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission is very generous in sharing their technical resources, their QAPPs, everything, the work that they do. Cool, clean water is going to be essential, and a few degrees are going to really matter. Okay, water and watersheds. Okay, I'm going to start going fast because we're a little bit behind schedule here. Water and watersheds. We've all heard from people around us that the nature of rain is changing, that we're seeing more, in some cases, of what are called male rain, where you get that sudden flash of just torrential downpour. Precipitation changes are going to be big. So think about, are you prepared? Are your streams able to handle it? Your culverts big enough? Just look at what water is doing. Talk to the experts, talk to people. Okay, snow. Less snow, remember, also means an increased fire danger. So just be aware of changes in snow in your area. I've got a beautiful picture of berries here for those of you like me who are berry pickers. Look first at how your traditional or first foods are going to be impacted. Traditional knowledge is your environmental baseline. Elders can share their observations and knowledge, and that will help you know kind of what lives where and what abundance did you have. Okay. Harvest times are changing, and elder knowledge can help you identify new times to plant and to gather. Okay. So your elders really have your baseline environmental information. They've watched the landscape. Okay. Landscape conservation cooperatives are kind of the new Department of the Interior mechanism to bring together research and scientists and partners. And they're funding some very cool traditional knowledge projects across the nation. For example, the Organized Village of Kasan is doing a calendar with the new harvest times for traditional foods with support from the Southeast LCC. Okay. So what can EPA do to assist tribes? First, EPA is very committed to their relationship with tribes. One of the things that I find pretty amazing is that over half the agency's budget is awarded as grants to achieve the agency mission of protecting human health and the environment. And a shout out to Mike Brubaker and the Leos, a program of the ANTHC. And I'll talk more about that later, but I'm very, very proud of that work. Okay. For those of you who have GAP grants, which is my particular expertise, you can use your GAP grants to work on climate issues. And I know the GAP paradox, that people are saying you can't be asked to do everything with GAP. I understand that. And I deeply wish that there were new sources of federal funding. Right now, Congress is still working on those issues. We have to do what we can with what we have. The GAP guidance will allow you to do this kind of work, and it can build a good foundation for you so that when funding is available, your tribe is prepared, that you're ready to go. If you do these foundational steps, then when the doors open for other funding, you're going to be ready. Okay, so I just want to encourage you for that. And those of you who would like to email me or contact me for different ways that you can work with your GAP funding, you're certainly free to do that. My email will be at the presentation. Okay. Tribal Science, National Science Project program. Our own Orville Huntington is a member of the National Science Council, Tribal Science Council, and I'm just very pleased that he is there. Okay. One of the things that I really encourage tribes to think about is demonstration projects. With communities facing costs in the billions to relocate, new technology is going to be essential. I'm very excited that Kivalina has a biochar project where they're looking at converting waste into energy. That could be a game changer for small communities. New building materials are going to be essential. Keep an eye on hemp, especially when it's made into what's called hempcrete. It's strong, light, and mold and fire resistant. Okay. Next. Okay. This is a picture. This blurry photo shows young architects from the Goldsmith Institute working with artists and hunters in Kivalina. And Kivalina is working with many partners to redesign their community so that it protects and expresses the traditional way of life and traditional values. So they're working on designing new space. They have a very cool blog, and it is called, you can just kind of do a Google search for Kivalina Climate Change blog, but it really talks about those partnerships. So this is an example of that thinking richly, imagining yourself not only safe, warm, and protected, but with spaces for artists and children, and be rich, be big in your thinking. Restoration. I think that restoration is one of the key climate change responses to help bring back resiliency. Healthy marine ecosystems, they're going to be essential. So look as you can for projects for restoration. Here's a nice example from Nez Perce. And just that planting, that restoration work, is helping to protect from floods, from fire, by just keeping the land healthier. Okay, so I think that restoration is going to be essential. Climate change is increasing the mobility of dunes in the Southwest. This is USGS scientists working with students and members of the Navajo Nation to do planting, do revegetation projects to help slow the dunes and to bring back the native plants. So again, think about how can we bring health back to the land. Mitigation, we can all do what we can. It's diesel, I think, is a big issue for many communities in rural Alaska. Funding, the University of Oregon did a really nice guide for tribal climate change funding. A shout out to Kathy Lynn and her group. Kathy Lynn has students who work on keeping this updated. It's searchable by keyword. It's a very, very useful tool. Okay. All right, and we are at the end. Okay, and I think we're going to transfer to Mike. Maybe what I'll do is, while they're working out the technical change, then I will take a question about with the hemp. Hello, Michelle Moses. Email me at davis.michellev@epa.gov, and I will forward your email or your question about hemp on to my friend Victoria, who has done a lot of research on that. Okay?
And we will actually switch over to Mike Brubaker with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. Michael Brubaker specializes in addressing health conditions in rural communities. In particularly, he focuses in on environmental pollution development and climate change. Mike was born in Juneau, Alaska and raised in Anchorage. He has earned his Bachelor of Science in Biology from St. Lawrence University and a Master in Science in Environmental Management from the University of San Francisco. He was a Peace Corps environmental volunteer in Hungary from 1995 to 1997 and has worked in the Alaska Tribal Health System for 17 years. He started the Local Environmental Observer, also known as the LEOS network, in 2011, and he publishes the weekly e-journal titled The Northern Climate Observer. Mike, if you want to advance your slides, we loaded it differently, so you're going to have to click the arrow button in the lower left-hand corner. With that, we will turn it over to you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. It's really nice to be here on this Earth Day related webinar and to be able to spend some time with folks in the ANA community. It's timely too, because just this week the U.S. Assumed chairmanship of the Arctic Council, that international organization of indigenous groups and nations that focuses on Arctic issues. And the chairmanship for the U.S. 2-year period, some of the major topics include climate change and quality of life for Arctic communities. So I think we can talk a little bit about that today. I wanted to provide an overview on some of the observations about climate change impacts in Alaska, and also to look a little bit more closely at the connections between climate change, environmental impacts, and community health, and just provide an example of how complex and indirect and connected those relationships are. Okay, just to revisit a little bit about what we know about climate change in Alaska. This is a map that's based on 50 plus years of temperature data collected in hub communities around Alaska. And this is the annual average temperature change. So you can see these numbers all over the map. And the real take-home from this is that everywhere you look in Alaska during that time period, the temperature has been increasing. And even a little bit of increase can be very significant if it means the difference between, for example, having rain and having snow, or having ice and having good ice versus poor ice, or when things hatch and when fish enter a river, things like that. So that's one of our measures of climate change here in Alaska. And we know, especially in the Arctic regions, that we have large landscape changes happening, and that A land that was once mostly frozen and resilient is now thawing and fragile. There's a picture by Ben Jones, who studies land change and lakes up in the Arctic, and people are often surprised to see that our coastlines are not all rock, but in many places they're just made out of frozen soil, and because of that, even these small changes in temperature can have big implications. So in 2000 and, well, I guess going back about 2009, we started a Center for Climate and Health here at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. And this is the purpose: to assist the tribal health system in understanding effects, raise awareness, and encourage strategies and responses that protect public health. And also to try to both understand what the risks are, but also to identify where there are benefits. And one of the things we've been doing to try to understand these connections is we've been visiting communities across Alaska and talking with local leaders, environmental managers, natural resource managers, people that work in the clinical setting or in search and rescue, and people who are experts in local subsistence and traditional ways of life. And that's been, that's opened all kinds of new understanding for us about climate change and helped us to begin to identify some of these health connections. So what are those? Well, there's, as we mentioned, there's positive and there's negative effects. And some effects are very direct, like risk of a heat stroke or risk of hypothermia, and many, many more are quite indirect. And you have to kind of understand the chain of connections to see how something that's happening with temperature might affect, for example, your ability to harvest a certain kind of food. These are the 5 categories that we focus on. Changes in rates and types and timing of disease and injury. Your food security, meaning both the availability of food, the quality of food, and whether you are confident in your food. And also water security, both the traditional sources and also the infrastructure that's built in order to get the water to the glass and to people's homes. And mental health. How is changes in climate in our communities affecting the way people feel about their lives and their ability to cope with new challenges and existing challenges in their lives. So I wanted to give you an example when we say these direct and indirect effects. One of the communities we've worked in before is located up on the Noatak River, north and east of Kotzebue, above the Arctic Circle. And Noatak is experiencing a wide range of effects. It's a river community. Of about 514 people. And wonderful place to visit if you ever have a chance. And the people there are closely linked with caribou. That's the primary source of protein in their traditional diet. And fish is also really important and continues to be really important. We can look at some of the local information about temperature. This is actually a downscaled model from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. It's based on data actually from Kotzebue, which is the closest hut community. But through their computer simulations, they're able to show both past temperature and trends for the future. And so we have a series of bars for each month of the year, and we have a color for different time periods. And the gray represents past, and the yellow represents a little bit of the past, but also some future projection data. And as far as the average temperature in each of those months, what you see is that in every single month, with the exception of July, the temperature has been increasing since 1961, between 1961, 1990, and 2010 and 2019. Temperatures have been increasing, and the biggest changes are happening in the winter. So what happens in NOAATAC with warming climate? Well, one thing is that years with less snow and less snowpack, and in some cases less rain, can affect the river level. And one of the major challenges for NOAATAC is their ability to navigate on the NOAATAC River and to get from one place to another and to get to important places that people need in order to perform subsistence or get supplies. On the good side, one benefit for health is that, you know, the kids are out enjoying the warm water, the slow-moving water, and they're out there. This was in 2011, but they were out there all day. So we do look for, you know, opportunities to identify these positive impacts. So it's great for swimming, or great for wading. And then I'm going to move on to the next slide. But it's certainly not that great for traveling. In fact, some areas are inaccessible now on the NOAATAC, at least seasonably, and moving along. And it's also more expensive because of the wear and tear on equipment, on the outboards, on the props, on the lower units of the outboards. And that comes with new hazards too. Especially those of you who travel rivers know that when the water gets shallower, sometimes you have to keep the boat up on step, and you have to travel at a good pace to do that. So there's a lot of adaptation happening, just understanding the right equipment and the right way to travel on a river that everyone knows quite well, but is not quite the same as it used to be. The other thing is you can't bring barges into NOAATAC, and that's been true for over a decade now. And so as an alternative, they use this propeller cargo plane to fly in fuel, and there's flights coming in regularly. And the airstrip, which really wasn't designed so much for big planes, but for smaller planes, it's located right alongside the village. And whenever that plane takes off and starts those props spinning, it sends up an enormous cloud of dust which blankets the community. And so in NOAATAC, especially in the summer, but other times of year as well, you'll hear people talking about respiratory issues and how hard it is to keep the dust out of the home. And in a community that's also quite warm and has rising temperatures in the summer, that can also be a problem because our homes, of course, are designed for cool and not for hot. And opening the windows up and letting some breeze in, it may be the only way you can cool your home down. So we're concerned about heat stroke and heat exhaustion as well. So what are some of the other effects of climate change? Well, I'm just gonna spin through these. These are some of the slides I shared at the Alaska Federation of Natives meeting this year. But one is that the weather is changing and becoming more extreme. There are people working very hard to try to protect their shoreline in Kivalina a few years ago. We know that there is less ice on the land and on the sea. And if you look at these glaciers in Lake Clark Pass, you can see how the snow's melted, leaving behind an ash layer over the glaciers. And that ash, which is old, absorbs heat and light and increases the rate of melting happening with these glaciers. As far as in the sea ice and on also the land ice, there is a shorter ice season. And this is a photo of out on a lead of a whaling crew that was taken in Barrow in June of 2004, showing more of a more traditional, or at least for the past century, the type of hunting that's been going on. And this next picture shows Barrow in June of 2013, where the hunters weren't out on a lead because the ice wasn't there, but instead they were butchering the whale on the beach, which was convenient, but it does provide some new challenges, and it was different. And it's not the nice, cold, hard surface for working on your whale, but it's sandy and dirty surface. But at least you don't have to worry about people falling in or hurting their backs. But you do have to take care of other sorts of food care concerns. So, hundreds of years of whaling activity is changing right now. We also know that there are fewer lakes. This picture up by Prudhoe Bay shows some of these drying lake beds and these little tundra lakes up north. And that's being caused partially could be by changes in snowpack, but also by thawing that's happening underneath the lakes and the permafrost dropping down and allowing these lakes to drain. This is a picture of the Woolwich River in 2009, where a lot of really rapid collapses happened of the riverbank. And one thing and again, you can see some of the hazards that might present with these big rafts of sod and tundra breaking off and drifting into the river where it gets kind of anchored. But a lot of our rivers are becoming wider and shallower in these ice-rich permafrost zones. We know that animal behavior and health is changing, and if you are here in Alaska, you've been following over the past few years about the haul-up of the walrus near Point Lay, where they're summering on the shoreline rather than summering on the ice pack. And we know also that conditions for hunting are changing. This is across from Kotzebue at a traditional whaling and sealing and fishing camp called Sisolak. And hunters were telling us about how the ice conditions made it, because it was drifting and the ice was drifting and thin, made it challenging for sealing and sometimes a little scary for the boats, because of the ice is so active and moving around. There's also new challenges for preparing food. We hear this all across Alaska, not just in the harvesting, but how to dry food. And here in many parts of Alaska, people will smoke fish, but up in the north, it's traditional just to dry fish and seal. And so having the right conditions and not too much rain is important. For it to be cool, and it has to be cool and some nice breeze and not much rain is perfect for drying fish. And with warmer and wetter weather, it's been challenging. And storing foods is a challenge as well. This is the end of a traditional ice cellar in Wainwright up on the North Slope. And that cellar is going to follow behind other cellars that have gone out to sea and been washed away. And so having a cold and dry cellar to store whale and muktuk in and other food has been traditional, and having warmer conditions like a refrigerator is not necessarily ideal for food storage. We've also seen a lot of die-offs occurring, not just with fish, but also with seal. This was a die-off that accompanied a huge run of chum salmon up the Kobuk River last summer. And those salmon, we think, because the water, because there were so many, because the water was warmer and the water level was lower, might have contributed to the die-off, as well as possibly some algal blooms also being contributing factors. And there are some declines happening in some really important food resources, like several of our caribou herds here in Alaska are now having to be more actively managed, and some restrictions put in for hunters. And that's kind of the same situation with salmon on the on the Yukon River and other parts of the state. Shellfish harvesting down in south central Alaska. There's a number of different examples. Walrus out in the St. Lawrence Island area where there's been declines, and people are wondering whether they're going to have as much success as they used to, and the reliability of their food harvest. Some animals are increasing their range, like this red fox. They're seeing further and further north now and are giving the local Arctic foxes a bit of a run for their money, while others are seeing their range decline, and we know how that is following the challenges for the polar bear. Transportation routes are being disrupted. This was a large landslide. The Alaska Department of Transportation is very, very underfunded in their ability to keep up with the new maintenance challenges that are occurring every year on the roads. And it's not just the roads, it's the rivers as well, and sea ice conditions and extreme weather affecting air travel. There's all kinds of new challenges for transportation, and it's through local observers and through technology and people being very cautious that we're able to continue to travel safely. And as Michelle was mentioning, many communities are vulnerable to land change, like here in Shishmaref, where not only is there erosion going on, but there's subsidence. And as the ice thaws, the ground drops. So it's very hard to come up with a projection of what the sea level impacts will be when you take into account both loss of ice, bigger waves, and rising sea level with the changes in the land. And this is some of the sort of similar projection information. There's very few tide gauges in Alaska to really understand how sea level is changing. We know in the south the sea level is dropping, actually, because the land is rebounding with glacier melt. But in most of the state, that's not happening, and we think that there's sea level rise occurring, and many communities could be affected. This is the community of Golovin after a flood in November 2011. And they, as a community, city and tribe together, and agencies they work with, are actively planning phase relocation to move up onto this hill that I'm standing on, or that Toby was standing on when it was taken. And here's an example of, this is up on the hill. This is looking the other way. This is a new water treatment plant. So examples of construction may be in better locations. So these are some of the things we have to do. Phase relocation, build infrastructure that's more resilient to change. So we're developing pipe systems that are more flexible so that if the foundations sink into the permafrost, it won't cause freeze up at the house. And people are having to change the way they think too. For elders, for those of us who expect to see certain kinds of weather every year at the right time, or are expecting to always be able to do the same kind of thing on our birthday because we always have been able to do that. That may not be the case anymore. We got to remember with the youth that their reality and what they've grown up with is not like that. It's about change, and so they're accustomed to a changing world, and we think that's going to serve them well as they learn to navigate through our new world. And we need to focus also on the positive that if we're adaptable, there are still many ways to achieve healthy ways of life, and maybe even to adopt some new ones as well. There's a nice picture of Linda Stotts working in her garden in Guyana, where they've been having great vegetable garden. So kind of in closing here, this is a picture by Kulan Batsarvani, who is a Mongolian intern who came and worked with EPA. And she made these nice pictures for us, imagining what a coastal village in the Arctic would have looked like at the time when people were first arriving during the Ice Age, with the ice up close and being able to travel across the ice, and then how that community might look like today, with the ice largely gone and the sea level, and the way our communities are constructed with storage tanks and doing a lot of subsistence down by the beach, and then trying to imagine how we could adapt to address the emerging challenges to make our communities more resilient and healthy. And this is what she came up with. And you can see how in her vision the sea level has come up, but there's been some armoring done of the beach, like it's happening in many communities now. Maybe some new transportation opportunities, and how the subsistence camp has been moved to a little bit higher ground, and how we have some alternative energy going on to take care of our energy needs and also reduce our carbon footprint. So I like that vision, and I agree with Michelle that creating a vision is really key for the long-term efforts to achieve healthy villages and healthy people. So thank you, everybody, for this opportunity to speak, and I wish you all a belated, but all the same, a very good Earth Day.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that very much. Okay, our next presenter is from the Sitka tribe of Alaska, and it's going to be Chris Whitehead. Chris is originally from Southern California, and he headed west and received his degree from the University of Hawaii in 2001. He worked in Hawaii as a researcher developing recirculating aquaculture systems to rear shrimp. And in 2005, he moved to Washington and began working as a shellfish biologist, managing commercial crab, shrimp, and geoduck fisheries for 2 Western tribes. Currently, Chris is the project director for the ANA project in Sitka. So, okay, Chris.
Okay, can you guys hear me? I don't have a microphone, so I'm kind of doing this end around through 3Star's phone system, so let me know if you guys can hear me okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. And like they were mentioning, yeah, we do have an ANA project that we're awarded here last October to develop a marine biotoxin lab here in Sitka. And really that's kind of the main icing on the cake to support this Southeast Alaska Tribal Toxin partnership that we started up back in late 2013. And I'll get into that in a sec, but just a little background about myself. I've been a tribal biologist for about 10 years, working with different tribes in Washington State. I've set up a couple different programs similar to this SEATT partnership, looking at phytoplankton and related to shellfish toxins, mainly because I was managing commercial fisheries that were very relying on good data from the state health department on if geoduck made a lot of money off of it, and it was a way to keep tribal citizens employed. So, anyway, so when I got to Sitka back in 2013, I've always been able to go down to the beach in Washington and look online to see if the beach was safe or not. It's a really easy process, and I got here and I was asking around, there's these great beaches, but how do you guys know if the clams are safe? And no one could tell me if it was safe or not, and it didn't seem like there was a system set up. And we have, in Sitka, there's a large brown bear population, and, in the middle of the street downtown, you could have a sow and cubs walking around, and no one's scared of the bears, but everyone, is terrified of the clams. No one wants to go to the beach and dig clams. So that's kind of where this all started, is just some elders and some other tribal citizens approaching me asking, what we can do to kind of get something started here. And so that's kind of how it moved forward. Let's see if I can advance here. So the Southeast Tribal Toxins Partnership, like I said, started in 2013. And just to give you a visual of Southeast Alaska and what tribes are involved. So it started originally with 7 tribes, but now, come this October, there'll be 11 tribes that'll be participating in the data collection and the partnership and all that entails. So just a good overview of spatially where our data is going to be coming from. We don't have a lot of the same climate change impacts as the rest of Alaska. The Arctic and the interior and northern Alaska, we don't have the permafrost issues or the erosion issues very much. Most of our issues are kind of wrapped around just the ability to harvest traditional foods, and a lot of the traditional foods that we're harvesting are coming from the ocean. So the harmful algal blooms, the ability to harvest clams and shellfish when they're not toxic is huge. And then the other big component that we're starting to look at with this group is ocean acidification. So just to kind of give you a background on that, we don't have the same issues that Michael was kind of bringing up in his last presentation there. So again, really, there really was no way for me to do this on my own, or for the Sitka tribe to tackle this big feat alone. So I had to reach out to the other tribes and see if they had the same issues, and they did. They were all concerned about their subsistence resources and the ability not to be able to access them due to this scare of health issues. So I went to the state and kind of talked to them a little bit about if there's any monitoring programs that they have set up. There really wasn't. There's some pilot projects going on at the time, but it was very limited on funding, and it wasn't something that at the time they were open to bringing in new tribes to. So I contacted all the rest of the Southeast tribes through our EPA IGAP system, and they were all pretty excited about doing some work together. So we all kind of drafted the same sort of work plan, and Michelle gratefully helped us along and get things set up to start doing baseline phytoplankton work starting FY15. So that was just this last October it kicked in. And that would give us this early warning system of, eyes on the water every week, basically, is what we're doing. We're sampling weekly at a certain spot where traditional clams and shellfish are harvested, and we're looking for the 3 species of phytoplankton that can cause toxins. So here's a slide of, there's actually 5 here, but if you just look at the 3 in yellow, those are the 3 that we're really concerned with. And I'll start at the bottom, because that's one most people are familiar with, which is the species that creates the saxitoxin is called Alexandrium, which produces the paralytic shellfish poison, or PSP, which most of you have probably heard of. The other one that we're looking at that is here, actually we have some up in Yakutat right now being identified, is Dinophysis, which produces the ocadaic acid, which is a diuretic shellfish poisoning, or DSP. It's kind of the worst case stomach, viral, cramping, diarrhea. I mean, you kind of wish you were dead kind of symptoms. And then the third one, which we have here as well, is pseudonychia, which creates a domoic acid, which is amnesic shellfish poisoning, and it creates, oh gosh, what is it called? It's my bad joke of the day. It's short-term memory loss. But so just to give you on a scale of what does that mean, saxitoxins, and how deadly can it be? These are toxins and agents from a chemical side of like where saxitoxins, at number 17, where that arrow is at, where that fits in on the scale. So at the very top is probably your most toxic, and then saxitoxin is number 17 there. So above the VX chemical agent that they put in, nerve gas. So that's the kind of potency that we're talking about. So it is, in high dosages and high quantities, it is super lethal. And speaking about, lethality, I mean, here is just a quick shot of Southeast Alaska. You've got, let's see, you've got all kinds of data all over the place, but everything that is above that 80 to 1,000, the black dots, that is the limit that the federal government regulates when shellfish are safe or not safe to eat. So once it goes over 80 micrograms of toxins per 100 gram of shellfish that's sampled, then it's no longer considered safe to consume. And that's when beaches start being closed, fisheries get shut down, recalls start to happen, things like that. So if 80 is kind of the buzz number, if you look up to that red box, there was, in 2011, there was mussels in Ketchikan that were reported over 50,000 micrograms. So the blue mussel that they collected, one of those mussels probably had enough toxins to kill 60 plus people. So that's the kind of levels that we're seeing in Southeast. So there's no way, for anybody to know that by looking at the mussels or the clams. They look perfectly fine. So if you're a visitor, you flew in from Ohio to Ketchikan to see Southeast Alaska, and you stay at a cabin or you're doing whatever, and you see all these great mussels on the beach or off of a dock, and you take some back to your hotel room and boil them up. I mean, that's how these cases usually happen. It's not so much the local folks, but a lot of the visiting tourists and folks that are just here in the off seasons or different times for short periods of times that may not know about what kind of lethality lies with harvesting clams and shellfish. And then that toxic shellfish poster there, that's what the state puts out on pretty much a lot of the beaches that have had any issues with the clams there. So this picture is in Sitka, and that poster has been on that tree for probably 4 or 5 years, and it never gets taken down. Even though the clams may be safe to eat at certain times, it always stays up there. So that brings us to who actually looks out for us in Alaska with PSP, and that lies to the Department of Environmental Conservation, or the DEC. But the DEC is limited. They only regulate on the commercial side of shellfish harvesting. So your shellfish growers, your geoduck harvesters, those folks have to send samples to DEC to get tested prior to shipment for consumers to purchase. So there is nobody that regulates for any toxins, PSP and others, for the subsistence user groups like if you wanted to go out and dig clams or any of the recreational folks. And again, it's that 80 micrograms of toxin per 100 gram of shellfish. That's the level that is set forth, and that's a federal level. So again, no subsistence or recreational testing, and DEC is not in any position or time frame when I talk to them to certify or even start looking at recreational beaches, and it's a lot. There's so much coastline in Alaska, it'd be hard to tackle all of it at once or even designate pieces. But so that's really where this SEATT group, the Southeast Alaska Tribal Toxin Network, is trying to focus on, is the subsistence and the recreational harvesters. We want to be able to provide some data to folks and let them know what we're seeing so they can make a better choice if it's time to harvest or not time. So this is what the monitoring program looked like. It's pretty straightforward right now. It's not even looking at shellfish until this fall, but right now we're strictly focused on phytoplankton. So a lot of these pictures are from our workshop we did here last October. But you're collecting phytoplankton in a phytoplankton net. You're looking at it under a microscope to do some IDing and some abundance. So we're not actually counting cells. We're giving kind of a estimate. So they'll either be present, they'll be common, or there'll be a bloom. So that's kind of a level of, we've only seen one, Alexandrium, or we're seeing, let's say less than 50, or, the whole slide is covered with Alexandrium. So then we know what kind of situation we have as far as in the water just with the cells. We're not even talking about the shellfish, because different shellfish species react differently and can pick up and hold on and retain the toxins different than others. So this is strictly just looking at phytoplankton. We have a workshop coming up in May that we're going to start actually filtering the water sample down and testing for toxins in the cells themselves. So still not looking at shellfish, just looking at the toxins coming out of the Alexandrium or the Dinophysis cells. So that's kind of that lower left picture. And then the final component to the big picture here would be actually testing shellfish in our lab, which I'll get to here in a bit. So here's more of just of the components. We collect, process the weekly samples. We are recording some other basic environmental parameters, temperature, salinity, air temperature, the tide, wind conditions, anything like that is all getting recorded. So we identify the species. We describe if there's a diversity, if we're seeing a lot of one or the other. The folks that are in this program get trained on how to identify all the different diatoms and dinoflagellants that we're seeing. And then we're starting this measuring toxins in the cells here in the springtime. And then this fall and into next year, we'll start actually looking at shellfish samples. So this work, and I should go back, but this work was, this is all EPA work. We haven't even talked about the ANA work that we're doing, but this is all funded through EPA IGAP funds that these tribes have come together to do this monitoring group. And it's great because we all have the ability to kind of put this together and have funds to get this really good equipment and to partake in these trainings. The microscopes are digital microscopes. They have built-in cameras, and you can either take a snapshot or a video. As soon as you do that, it gets dumped into a folder, and you can email that right to me. If you say Ray and Juno can't identify something, he can take a picture, email it to me, and ask me what it is, and I can reply. Or I can forward that on to some of our NOAA colleagues that are also partners in this project. So just some of the equipment, and I mentioned the trainings we do, and 2 workshops a year, and that depending on what time of year it is will depend on what we're going to be focusing on. So in the fall, we focus on the phytoplankton, just the IDing, mainly the pictures you're seeing here, kind of that work. And then in the spring, we're going to be focusing on, again, how to get your sample down onto the filter media and getting that here to Sitka to sample. And then next fall, we'll be doing a little more of the shellfish sampling. So a lot of the folks that are participating, they're updating their quarterly newsletters for the tribes as far as what they're seeing. No big information is going out just yet because we've just started, but a lot of it is just kind of getting the word out of what's going on and educating the public and the communities about what different phytoplankton can do, what we're seeing, how the program is set up. Again, that we're not certifying a beach. We're not saying it's safe or not safe at this point. We're just explaining what we're seeing. The other big thing that we're working on is, and it should be rolling out here in May, is a new website that all of our data, all of our training material, all the partnerships, everything that this group is going to be working working on will be housed on it, and it's going to be the Southeast Alaska Tribal Ocean Research, or SEATT, and it's down at the bottom of the page there, SEATT.org. You guys will be able to go to that and kind of see all these different projects. The SEATT project that you're kind of seeing here, the phytoplankton group, as well as some ocean acidification work we're going to be doing. So all the data that we collect, luckily I didn't have to create a database because that's not really my wheelhouse at all. I rely on a lot of other folks. NOAA has been a huge component and collaborator on this project. They have helped me in the past down in Washington set up programs like this. So it was friends of mine that I've already known that work in the marine biotoxin programs in Seattle and in Charleston. So we were able to tap into their database, and all of our data gets dumped into the National Phytoplankton Monitoring Network, which is great because different researchers and growers and managers can go in there and look to see what kind of blooms are happening all over the nation. It's a great tool. So again, we're not recreating the wheel. Like I said, in Washington, when I was down there, we've done this before, and these are two programs that are actually running right now in Washington. Out on the outer coast is the Olympic Region Harmful Algal Bloom Partnership, or ORHAB, and that collaboration of tribes, NOAA volunteers, nonprofits, and the shellfish growers, and the same with the Sound Toxins Partnership. That's the one that I worked on in Squim Bay, which is kind of on the northern portion of the Olympic Peninsula there. So really the benefit for doing all this is that we're going to be able to provide that early warning system to communities as far as what we're seeing in the water, and be able to develop some forecasting tools that will be associated with climate change as we see water temperatures increase. A lot of outreach will go out to the citizens and to subsistence harvesters, either through newsletters, or the SEATT website will be a great place to check. Eventually on that website there'll be an interactive map. There is a map there now, but it's just a kind of a map that I showed in the beginning of the presentation of where the sites are. But eventually each community will have certain beaches mapped out, and it'll be a GIS map that you can click on which beach you're at or you want it to go to, that at least it has information about it, and it'll tell you when the last shellfish sample was taken, what the data was, if it has met regulatory standards or not, and that'll give people a good sense of information to then make their best decision on if they should go dig clams or not. If you looked at Washington Department of Health, they have an interactive website that they use to manage their beaches, and so it'll be similar to what that is set up to be, an interactive way to get people to be able to access this resource and have some level of comfort doing so. We'll be coordinating with local and state health departments, which we're already doing now. A lot of the PSP issues that have come about, or the incidences that happen, obviously get reported to the health departments, and so if we can let state and local health departments know that we're seeing blooms of Alexandrium at certain beaches, and then they get somebody that comes in that's sick, and it's from that area, they might have some more information to do some diagnosis to see if they were actually did get PSP toxins in them. And then the main thing too is to provide this baseline data set for the SEATT group, so that we can kind of track this as climate change increases and we start seeing different things happen. We have a good data set to move forward on. But I think for me, coming from Washington and working with tribes up here, is just the credibility that it's going to bring to the tribes that are doing this work. I mean, we're going to be collecting some great data. We're going to be using methodologies and protocols that have been used by other state and federal agencies and other tribes in other areas. So it'll just bring us up to that level that will be good to move forward with other work with universities and other state agencies. talk about all that first because that is really the backbones or the meat and potatoes of this whole project. The STA Toxin Analysis Lab is really like the icing on the cake of this whole thing, and that's the ANA portion that was funded, is this lab. So, it's great that the phytoplankton group, the SEATT group, is able to have eyes on the water every week, look at the toxin levels in the cells, and get shellfish to a lab. But the problem was we didn't have a lab to go to. We did talk to the state about possibly using their lab to run samples, but the turnaround time for the state right now is extremely high. So just to back up, as for national and federal regulations, you have 7 days from the time you take the sample out of the ground and to the time and then it has to get tested. And then if it's good, if it meets the regulatory standards, so it's less than 80 micrograms of toxins per 100 grams of your shellfish sample, then you can say, or you can sell, basically it's used for the commercial side, you have 7 days to either harvest or move that product or get that product out of the ground from that area. And then when you hit 7 days, you got to take another sample. So that's all very reasonable and doable, and it's done everywhere. But for the DEC lab, at least right now with the capacity that they have, their turnaround time is more or less 2 plus maybe 3 weeks. So it doesn't do any good if you do all this work and you collect this a clam sample from a beach and you send it off. It might take 3 days to get there or 2 days to get there, and then you don't hear back or get any data for another 2 weeks. That time lapse, the data isn't useful anymore because you can't say it's safe or not anymore for folks that want to go digging. So that's really why we decided to just set up our own lab and do it here in Southeast. It'll save some travel time, and we can just focus strictly on the subsistence side of things for now. And what that will do is it'll allow the tribes to establish their own subsistence shellfish management plans. So if the tribe has a big potlatch coming up or a party and they want to be able to get clams and some traditional foods, they have an avenue of sending us samples and us testing it and letting them know if it's safe or not. And they can make their best assumptions of if it is or not. Based on, we'll be using all the same regulatory standards and using the same techniques that's been approved by the federal government. So there's no difference in our lab than, let's say, a lab that's running for the state or for NOAA. It's all going to be the exact same, and the folks that are doing the training on getting us up to speed are those same folks. So it'll be an FDA-approved lab at the end of the day. And then we have a big possibility to expand the lab and to do some more water quality work, specifically with ocean acidification. So there's a lot of potential with the lab. It's pretty far out. I'll move down to that here in a sec. Just wanted to describe this picture. So this is an oyster farm I set up in Squim in Jamestown when I worked for the Jamestown tribe. So those are all small bags with oysters that would tumble back and forth in the tide. So we had geoduck buried underneath the oysters, and then back further towards the tree line there was a clam bed. So the tribe managed a large farm there and sent all their samples through the State Department of Washington Health there, and was able to sell and move product, and things worked really smoothly. So the ANA project, this is just a quick timeline of where we're at, so just so you know that we're not going to be able to get that quality data and run those shellfish samples really until the end of year 2, beginning of year 3, so FY16, and then into 2017. So this year was mainly focused on consulting with NOAA and doing a lot of research on the equipment, setting up the lab space, which we're doing now. The electrician's in the other room right now banging away and getting things squared away. Ordering all the equipment, which is a big to-do. you basically have a white room with nothing in it, and you have to build this lab that's going to meet FDA requirements. It's a lot of legwork. So we're in the midst of that now, and then pretty soon here we're going to hire a lab technician or manager to do a lot of this work. We're going to be getting some training from NOAA out in South Carolina on the specific analysis method that we're using, which is a receptor binding assay. I won't get into a lot of that. You can Google that, and because I know we're kind of short for time. And then in year 3, we're basically collecting samples from different groups to run simultaneously down. The samples will be run in Washington, they'll be ran in South Carolina, and they'll be ran here, and then we'll have triplicates of all the data, and that will be used to certify us with the FDA as well. We're also working closely with the Southeast Alaska Regional Dive Fishery Association, which is the geoduck industry, and we'll be using some of their samples and hopefully talking to them about developing some sustainability for the lab, using our lab to do some of their analysis. Oops, let's see. Just real quick, I kind of mentioned the funding that IGAP has given for this a lot of the SEATT work, and then so you can look. I'll let you just look at it, but it's a lot from EPA, a lot from BIA to help as well. BIA, STA and a couple of the other tribes submitted some requests that we answered for funds to help with the training and the workshops and creating some training material. So we have a workshop coming up in May that will be videoed, and there'll be a DVD made of all the training procedures that will be housed on our website as well. And then the ANA grant that came in for the lab. So the ones in red are ones we're kind of waiting on, but the whole group, the SEATT group, is anticipating to get funds through IGAP again for FY 16 and 17 to keep the project rolling. And then STA is also submitting Ocean and Coastal Management grant to BIA here, actually tomorrow is the due date for that, and I think Sean's going to talk a little bit more about that, but that will be to add 2 new components to this program, and we'll be looking at ocean acidification and looking at cyst beds, which are basically just as your terrestrial plants in the winter go dormant and then they bloom again in the spring, same with these phytoplankton. So they'll reach a blooming point, and then at the end of the summer, when the water cools, they'll kind of drop back down to the sediment and rebury themselves, and then in the spring they'll bloom again. But so if we can identify areas where there's high concentrations of cysts, then that kind of rules out an area where you should be harvesting shellfish. But because of climate change, a lot of those places can be moving around, and so we still don't have any information on where those beds are. So there is a little bit of work in Washington going on with that, and so we're hoping to link up with those folks. Again, just to mention, there's our second workshop going to be in May, and then another one this November. All the funding is EPA and BIA funds to get folks here, and a little bit of ANA funds for some of the trainers as well. So that's just a shot from our last workshop we did. But if there's interested tribes that wanted to attend, this probably isn't the best one for folks that aren't planning on doing any of this work, like if they don't have funding to attend. But if it's something that you wanted to do down the road, the November 2015 one is going to be a good one as well. So you can always get a hold of me if you have if you have any questions. I think I had one more slide with my contact info, but I'm sure you can shoot out an email to these folks, or I can put it on the chat line there. So that's all I got. I try to go fast, so I know we're running late.
Okay, thanks a lot. That was an amazing presentation. And it's a good example of how a tribe has used multiple funding sources to develop a program and work towards implementing the program. And also a good example of how ERE funds have been used to develop capacity and baseline data. Okay, thanks. Our next presenter is from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this is Sean Hart, the Climate Change Coordinator. Getting an echo.
I don't think we need to read all of that.
Okay. Just getting a slight echo. You sound good though, Sean.
Great.
Go ahead, Sean. Thank you very much.
Do I have control? Looks like
Yep.
it. Okay, I know we've run long and my presentation is actually pretty short, but if you think, so my funding is climate change coordination, supporting, it's not operational funding, it supports the engagement of project managers to consider climate change and what they do and add resilience. So it's the adaptation side of climate change. So you might ask how I do that, So what I have, the slide in front of you is, it's sort of the cycle that you would do if you were considering climate change, not only as a manager, but as an organization. So initially, that box that says strategic planning, that's where a lot of our investment's been so far. And really what that is saying is, the tribe gets together and leadership says, we're going to apply for a strategic planning grant. It's for climate adaptation. And it's sort of a signal to all the staff, to all you guys, to come together and start planning. But you really don't have enough information to really change what your program's doing, but you have enough information to start the process, to engage in it, to start paying attention to webinars, start looking for information, and identify sort of broad vulnerability assessment, or vulnerabilities. And some people will have more information than others, Natural resources, transportation are doing pretty well. Health, it's more tenuous. We had some information from Mike, but at least for me, there's less information, less webinars for health than there are for natural resources. Then the next step would be vulnerability assessments, detailed ones. These are the ones that take a lot of time. They're information that we didn't have before because the systems are changing, the environment's changing. That housing site requirements are changing. So what is your vulnerability there? And that's not usually something that an individual program manager does. We're implementers as program managers. That's something usually you get somebody who's got research ability, data, that kind of thing. That's to give information to program managers about sort of what the suite of management choices they have, where they can engage, where they can invest their time to get more implementation. After that, it'd be programmatic plan. So that's where you would write down those choices that the tribe or village, wants the manager to make, the range of choices, how you incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into plans. Then it goes to implementation, monitoring, which monitoring happens all the time too, but monitoring for what those choices are in a changing condition, and then reevaluating. So what does the BIA do to support that? So we have really two categories in our climate initiative. The White House gave us money to really launch this. So there's technical support, so that's coordination of the federal agencies. That's us supporting training, both national and regional trainings that program managers and tribes generate. A web portal, we don't have it up yet, but a web portal to provide a sort of one-stop shop for people who are just starting this planning process. Digital tools, some of that stuff's up on the Climate Resilience Toolkit, the White House's webpage. We're going to get a page on that for tribal nations. And then science. And So how do we get the government to start moving our direction and getting more tribal and Native Alaskan science going in the climate science centers? Excuse me, and GIS technical support. So who's crunching that data for you? Who's helped other tribes and villages to start working on that so that you don't have to learn everything on your own? So that's our technical support side. And then there's our funding side. This is grants that close tomorrow, and there'll be another cycle we'll announce in a few months. But that's adaptation planning. So that's that strategic planning. Vulnerability assessments, we mostly concentrate on the strategic planning side. Vulnerability assessments, monitoring, and that's limited. I need to highlight that if your program never gave you enough money, your operations program never gave you enough money to monitor whatever it is that you need, that we're not able to supplement that. We don't have enough funding to do all the adaptation planning, much less have every program do monitoring. So what's the climate piece you're trying to identify for a tipping point or a management decision point, an indicator species that will help managers make a decision when to change their management or improve resilience? So that's the key part for monitoring. It's sort of supplemental monitoring. It's not replacing your baseline. So, if foresters are already out measuring forest stands, is there a key component they need to measure that will cost them more than their current one? That might be considered, but them just saying, yeah, I need to measure, I didn't have enough money last year to measure all my plots. Can you support it? So we can't do that. The key one that you guys might want to pick up on is travel support. So every manager needs more information than they had. And slowly this training and workshops is coming online. So travel support, direct travel support, your actual costs, not your salary. And those we've been able to fund almost every request as long as it's reasonable. If you write a generic request that says, I need to send people to 10 trainings in 10 different places, 10 people, you got to be more intentional than that. And then we're trying to help build capacity with local training. So we'll fund coalitions of tribes and tribal colleges building up, identifying local needs and having a workshop, and then build capacity and maybe take over that national training session information. So what we've done in the past, these red arrows show where we really focused our money, $10 million in the past. That's strategic planning and then travel support, training, that kind of thing. In 16, so there's $10 million budget in climate change. In 16, the president has suggested, or it's in the budget, for a $20 million increase. And that would allow us not only to fund more of the strategic plans tribes are asking for, but also invest in vulnerability assessments, that longer term, heavy data use and analysis that we usually don't do, that we usually have somebody else do, a researcher or contractor. So that's where we would head for if we get this increase. And Congress, and our increase isn't sure, and we're not even sure that they won't cut our budget, but we got to plan for it, and hopefully they won't cut it too badly, I guess. So tomorrow is the deadline for our current grants. So I apologize if your tribal leadership didn't pass on that notification and you're going to miss it, but we will get one up in the fall. So we have $8 million in climate adaptation, $2 million in coastal and ocean and coastal planning. So that was originally designed as blue water planning, $1 million for actual planning, and then $1 million to go to participate in regional planning bodies, which is this blue water, the Navy and tribal group and the state get to, and every player gets together and talks about blue water ocean planning and spatial location of, where the traditional harvest area is, where the Navy's shipping, the shipping lanes are, where the Navy testing range is. But there aren't a lot of tribes that are participating in that just yet, so we expanded that to say participation in planning forums, figuring out which tribes will be represented on those planning bodies, that kind of stuff. Ocean and coastal doesn't have to be climate related. It can be. So ocean and coastal includes you got permafrost melting, erosion, and you have infrastructure issues. You can do planning for that, emergency management planning, as long as it's tied to ocean and coastal. Then back to our climate adaptation. That's climate intentional work, that big cycle I talked about before. So that has some 14 money left over, which has to go out, and 15 money. 14, it's called 14-15 money. So I really have to spend it by September, and then some 15-16 money. And then one other thing that I hadn't mentioned before is youth internships, both working with a program in some climate specific task for them, or doing research at a tribal college, or if tribes want at a university partner. And so that's to train that next generation of managers and get them thinking about climate and constantly changing climate in their management. So it's really to start them young, so that next generation coming up. So history-wise, we funded $2.5 million last fall. In 13, we only had $640,000 for awards. But we should have about, there'll be $8 million put out, at least $8 million put out in the stuff that's coming in tomorrow. And I already mentioned our ocean and coastal, but it's a new program, so nobody's applied for that before. We actually don't have a history of what people are gonna be interested on that one. So that's actually all I have. I'm just gonna go back to that slide that shows what the planning cycle is. And I know that we've run really long, and if anybody has any questions for me, you can write to me at sean.hart@bia.gov. But know that tomorrow I'm going to get 150 applications in, and so I might not get back to you quite as quickly as I would normally. So I'm going to hand this back over to you guys.
Okay, and thank you for that in-depth presentation on the BIA funding that has been made available. We will do kind of a Q&A at the end, so I do see there is a couple of questions being asked in the chat. We'll just kind of answer those all real quick together at the end. One of the things that we like to do is provide you guys with resources to kind of help guide your projects, and also some resources in terms of where some additional funding might be found, or where you could get some supplemental training. Michelle had mentioned in her presentation about the Oregon school completing the database, and one of the other places that we wanted to highlight real quick is the Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona, has the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. Now, this organization was created in 1992, and it provides environmental trainings for people who work in the field. The Tribal Climate Change Adaptation Planning Toolkit is something that they've kind of recently got into. They provide background material, checklists, various templates in terms of planning guides versus the programmatic. Worksheets, spreadsheets, templates. It's all available there at the web address. It's a very long address, so I'll let you guys just click on that. They do the ITEP training, training in climate change adaptation planning. Over a dozen have been offered since 2010, and it's kind of an introduction to kind of kickstart your projects. They do regular climate change webinars. If you're interested in attending any of the webinars, you could visit that link that's provided. And they do provide plenty of resources. You could sign up for their monthly newsletter, could register at their website, and they do profiles, case studies that you could view and kind of use as a guide. If you have any questions specifically about the program, you could contact Sue Watkins and visit any of the websites that are provided to view any of the material that's being provided. So for a quick recap today, we wanted to remind you guys of everything that we've gone through with the Environmental Protection Agency, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, the Sitka Tribe of Alaska, and the BIA, is these are all resources that you guys could tap into, either on where funding is available, where program support is available, or just to share some ideas. With that, we will transition into the questions and answers. Sean, I did see that they had a couple of questions for you right off in terms of, is there any funding for erosion control?
Do operational. So if you're looking at analysis of, speed and rate and all that stuff, and what'll, planning for the village strategic, yes. But if you're looking at, can we stabilize the shoreline and it's going to cost, $50 million, there's not enough money in the budget. So we can't do the implementation, but for sure the planning part. Okay.
I see that Michelle is actually typing in some answers to some of these as we go through. That she doesn't know about funding, but she could definitely help you find some resource links. Is there any other questions? We do have a real quick one for you, Sean. We noticed that in your funding opportunity announcement for this, it was listed as possibly being a 638 funding source for the tribes, and we were just curious if that is true, because 638 compact funds can be used as match for ANA ERE projects, and that's kind of one of our interests to find out for potential ANA applicants.
So 638 is the mechanism for sending it. And for the BIA side, 638 money loses its federal character when it goes to the tribe. So there's none of that, you can't match with other federal stuff. And for us, we, in our proposals, we don't care where the match comes from. We'd like to see other money leveraged. And so if it's other federal funds, if it's 638, if it's in-kind, tribal staff time, that all counts to our funding. So we're really liberal on that side. But for funding for other partners, 638 loses its federal character, and you can count it.
Okay, thank you. That was something that we try to educate people on, is because it creates that revenue stream that could help fund or provide match for some ANA projects. I know that the EPA IGAP was also mentioned as one of the possible match sources, just because it as long as the projects align. So, is there match requirement for the BIA climate change applications, and if so, how much?
Okay, it's not required, but you get more points. So it bumps you ahead of somebody who's equally rated equally for all other factors. But if you throw in staff, it's a staff time contribution, then you get those points. So it's not really an issue for most applications.
Okay. Is there any other questions? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to stop the recording